Hi everyone, welcome to the August 24th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and on this episode we will be reviewing last weekend's racing from around the country, including the Pacific Classic card at Del Mar, the Alabama at Saratoga, the Queen's Plate up north at Woodbine, the Island, which earned a really nice speed figure at Monmouth Park, and we'll wrap up the show by talking about some notable two-year-old performances from around the country. But before we get to the racing, the good news this week is that not only are these podcasts back after a bit of a hiatus, but this episode will mark the much-anticipated return of the usual co-host of this podcast, Craig. It is great to have you back. I know that it's been a tumultuous few months for you and your family, but I'm glad that things are going well now that you feel comfortable coming back to the podcast. So welcome back to the show.
Yeah, things are going great. I'm very happy to be back. Everybody's healthy and doing well here now. So really excited, even getting out this weekend for the first time in a very long time, heading to Charlestown for the Charlestown Classic Friday night. Going to see some old high school friends. So yeah, looking forward to getting back to normal. It's kind of funny, I actually pulled up the notes I use, and the last one of these we actually did was recapping the Belmont Stakes, so it's even been a little longer than I realized, but such is life, and just glad to be back.
Yeah, it's been a little while, and I do want to thank everybody who helped fill in on this podcast for that brief period of time when we were trying to continue a little bit and soldier on without Craig. I want to thank all the various guests who filled into the guest co-host spot, but I really missed getting Craig's input throughout that time, so it's kind of great to get back to this usual dynamic that we've got going, and we can do our deep dives into some of the speed figures, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So, Craig, let's start things off with that Del Mar card, and the Pacific Classic was the big race on Saturday, really the big race around the country. That was the major Grade 1 event in the handicap division, and I think that this race was marked just as much by some big improvements from a few horses like the winner Tripoli, as it was by some really surprising no-shows in this race, particularly the two favorites, Express Train and Royal Ship, who just weren't able to deliver their top efforts, and that left the door open for a horse like Tripoli to walk through, and boy, has this guy gotten good since they switched to dirt.
Yeah, it seems like Horonis Racing Stable just has a hammerlock on this race lately. I think it's the third time they've won it in recent years, and that kind of jumped out to me when I saw this horse, because he kind of fit the pattern of horses that they plucked out, and he's a horse who actually had done a bunch of running on turf, which made sense because he was bred for it, but they finally switched him to dirt, and he certainly took to it. Now, I don't want to get too excited about this race because, to be honest, the Grade 1 for older males, basically what we've been talking about all year, wasn't particularly fast. He only got a 122 TimeformUS speed figure, but it was good enough to beat this field. I mean, it's $1 million race. They certainly did the right thing with him. As you said, a couple just total no-shows in here. Royal Ship didn't surprise me so much because I thought he really tailed off in his last after a couple of really huge efforts where he flirted with that 130 TimeformUS speed figure mark, and he just had nothing. But Express Train's a horse who had been ultra consistent all year, always running right around that 120, low 120s, and he just did nothing whatsoever. So I think the fact that Tis a Magician was able to run second, the horse who's been basically a long distance specialist, and actually set the pace in here, which was kind of surprising to me, shows that it just wasn't the strong race. And the one horse I really want to get your opinion on, because I just find him befuddling, and I know you're more into watching the horses and how they run and their strides, and I just can't wrap my head around Dr. Post. And I'm sure as much as it drives me crazy, I can only imagine what it does for Todd Pletcher and the ownership group with him, because he's a horse who just seems oftentimes to be totally disinterested during races. So curious what you think about some of those trips in here.
Yeah, it was one of those races where just about a quarter mile into the race, you could tell that certain horses were not in the positions you expected them to be. I know I didn't anticipate that Express Train would be 7th coming around the clubhouse turn. He has had a lot more tactical speed than that in the past, and I don't know if it was certain riders not being as aggressive coming out of the gate, knowing that they had to go 1.25 miles, or what was going on, but he was out of position, and as you said, Dr. Post was really out of position. I mean, he was just totally disengaged by the time they were passing the half mile. mile pole. And Todd Pletcher, he's got a few horses like this. I mean, Vino Rosso immediately comes to mind, a horse that would run a lot of races like this, where it seemed like he just wasn't interested in competing before they got into the stretch. And eventually, with the addition of blinkers and stuff, Pletcher figured him out. Dr. Post is already wearing blinkers, so I don't know what they're going to do with him. I mean, I question if Dr. Post really has the talent to be winning these kinds of Grade 1 races. I know that he achieved some placings in the Belmont Stakes and some other races like that as a 3-year-old, but I personally think maybe he has a ceiling at this level. But some others just seemed like maybe they didn't like being as far back as they were early, and they just were not really ever engaged in the race. So I don't know what to make of it. I don't know what to make of the top 2 going forward, but my sense is that this race is not going to scare off any of the East Coast handicap horses that we've kind of been regarding as the leaders of this division.
Yeah, and I think at this point it's pretty obvious the leaders are 3-year-olds, with Mystic Guide being injured, I believe. They're just faster, and they're only going to get a little more faster, I would think, as time goes on. The only other horse I want to mention out of this field is Independence Hall. Could we please get this guy back to 1 turn? It just feels like they're leaving a lot of races on the table chasing something that's just not going to happen.
Yeah, they've now run him 1.25 miles twice. I just think that trip is beyond his capabilities. And, I don't know if he's a sprinter or maybe he's one of these miler types, but the race like the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile seems like it really has his name written on it. So we'll see how they get him there, if they can keep him sound until then. But yeah, he's kind of a frustrating one with the way that they've been campaigning him. And yeah, I agree with you. The 3-year-olds, I'll be very interested to see what happens in the Travers this week with Essential Quality, but it does feel like it's kind of Nick's Go in a tier above everybody else, and then the 3-year-olds and the rest of the older horses below that. So we'll have to see how those horses shake themselves out in the upcoming months. The other Grade 1 race at Del Mar on Saturday was the Del Mar Oaks for the 3-year-old fillies, going 1 1/8 miles on the turf. And Going Global got back to the winner's circle here. She had lost at a short price in the prep for this race, but she's now 5 for 6 in this country. And with the exception of last time, she just continues to show up with solid efforts.
Yeah, she won again with a 1:14 TimeformUS speed figure. I mean, I'm not going to knock it. It's a solid effort for a 3-year-old filly. We have seen some better this year. We've seen some pretty weak classes in years gone by, but this isn't one of them. I can't remember the filly from overseas who won at Arlington and also won in New York. She just looks
Santa
like
Barbara.
Yeah, she just looks like a powerhouse. So, I mean, she's no real comparison to a horse like her, but she's certainly consistent as they come. I'm not sure what they're going to do with her. It gets kind of tough if you're thinking Breeders' Cup with a horse like her, because she's got to improve quite a bit to compete with older. So maybe they'll just keep seeking out these 3-year-old spots. I mean, as you said, she's done very little wrong. She's a half length from winning. I think it's 6 out of 7, or winning all 7 of her starts here in the state. So certainly a solid enough filly, but if you're thinking Breeders' Cup for her, she definitely got to get better.
Yeah, I mean, my big knock against her coming into this race and even the last race was that she's a horse who has gotten a lot of great trips in her races, but she does have that running style where she can come from off the pace or be close if they're going slowly up front. And in this spot, she was kind of able to get the jump on some other horses, which really helped her here. I had taken a shot in this race with closing remarks, and I thought she was maybe a little bit unlucky because she had to wait for room at the top of the stretch, but she did lose by a length in the end. And she's just the kind of horse that has had a few more trips than Going Global has had, and when it keeps happening that way, sometimes you wonder if maybe Going Global is just able to use her versatility to have a bit of an advantage over everybody else. So yeah, I agree with you. She's done really well. She runs faster than sometimes we usually see in this division of horses in California, but there are some good fillies in this division on the East Coast, so it'll be interesting to see where she ultimately fits.
Yeah, and you make a good point about the running style, because she's the kind of horse that can be dangerous to handicappers like us, because she's very versatile. I mean, she's won from 6 furlongs all the way out to 1 1/8 miles. She drops back off of really fast paces, but when the pace is slow, she's able to stay in contact. She doesn't drop back and get herself into a spot that she can't come out of. So maybe she's just one of those horses that is really tactical, I guess. I don't really like saying that. I don't get it, but for lack of a better term, she's a horse who just seems to do whatever the race shape says she needs to.
And we also had some other graded stakes on this Saturday card at Del Mar, including the Grade 2 Del Mar Mile. going the mile distance on the turf. And I think we've got another player in this mile division leading up to the Breeders' Cup Mile, as Mo Forza just kind of picked up where he had left off last year. It's been a while since this horse has been able to put a full campaign together because he keeps needing these long layoffs. But I mean, Peter Miller just keeps bringing him back in top form. And I mean, looking through his PPs, he's now won 7 of his last 8 starts, with that one loss coming in the Pegasus World Cup a couple of years ago. But I mean, if he's able to stay sound through the fall, he's going to be a major player in this division.
Yeah, he's the one horse on the card, I think, that if you're thinking Breeders' Cup, he would jump out at you. I kind of overlooked his performance at first because I figured he just ran his usual speed figure in the low 120s in one of these good efforts, but he actually ran a lifetime best 126, which is definitely a grade 1 type number, and it's what you'd expect from a 5-year-old to be peaking at this point, especially for a turf horse. He might even have a little more in the tank, and he did it the right way, too. I mean, the pace was slow. All the fractions are coded in blue in the TimeformUS PPs. And he was able to make up significant ground on a horse like Smooth Like Straight, who just seems to run the same exact race every time. Sometimes he's good enough, sometimes he's not, but you know he's always going to be there at the end. He's another one that's run low 120 speed figures, it feels like about 10 times in a row now. So Mo Forza didn't beat any slouch there. He certainly, I mean, Smooth Like Straight, I don't think he's a horse who you're going to say is a champion, but he's certainly tough to get by, and he was able to do it under adverse conditions.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the pace just never really developed in this spot, and I think Umberto Rispoli, who was riding Smooth Like Straight, probably thought he was sitting in the perfect spot, stalking that overmatched Neptune Storm, who he figured to reel in and go on to the victory. And really, Smooth Like Straight looked like he had the race won coming into the stretch, but Mo Forza produced a nice late kick, and I loved watching Flavien Prat handle this horse because it was almost giving me flashbacks to Ramon Dominguez, who was known for his really strong hand rides, and Flavien never took the whip out on this horse, just hand rode him all the way to the finish very confidently. Definitely a horse with a ton of ability. The major question is soundness, obviously, because he's had made just 3 starts in the past 18 months. So you want to see if he's going to be able to maintain this form and put 3 starts together going into the fall to the Breeders' Cup. But if he's able to continue this momentum, he's definitely a major player in the division. Another race from that Saturday card at Del Mar on the turf was the Grade 2 Del Mar Handicap, going 1 mile and 3/8. And this one was just dominated by long shots, as there were definitely some trips to talk about, but one horse who really had no trouble in the running was the winner, Astronaut, who got the job done at, I think, 24-1. And this is a horse that personally, having watched him begin his career in New York and having since gone on to John Sadler, I never really pegged him as a horse that was going to turn into a graded stakes winner, but I think circumstances just kind of worked in his favor in this race.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of this race, to be honest. It only got a 119 TimeformUS speed figure, which is certainly below par for a grade 2, but it's the best he's ever run. He came in off a 113 when he was second last time out, I believe, in that San Juan Capistrano at 1 mile and 3/4. So it was a pretty big turn back for him, actually. And then we saw Masterpiece was the horse he was able to hold off at the end, a horse that I'm sure you're familiar with from the East Coast. I think he used to be in Chad Brown's barn. And then Acclimate, who I don't know, he's got to be 7-8 years old by now, who's run some big races in the past, but we haven't really seen him before. And for me, this race was more about the horses who didn't really run very well in United and Arklow, the 2 favorites, and also even Say the Word, who was back in 5th. So again, not the strongest of races. It's kind of why I gravitated towards that Del Mar Mile. I think it was by far the best race for the class on the card. Didn't think a whole lot of this one, and the odds kind of showed it was a real puzzle.
Yeah, I mean, and by the way, I misspoke. John Sheriff's, not John Sadler's, the trainer of Astronaut, getting my initials confused. But yeah, I mean, I think when a horse like him and Masterpiece are able to dominate a race like this, you kind of have to look at how the trips worked out. And I think this is the kind of race where if the trips had worked out a little differently, we could have had United and Say the Word completing the exacta here, because both of them had significant trouble in the running. United just buried in traffic at the top of the stretch, and he's not the kind of horse with the quickest turn of foot, so you really do need to wind up United from a long way out, and Flavien Prat was just never able to do that, kind of stuck between horses on the stretch, and he ultimately got clear on the rail late, but it's hard to make a run through inside when you're a horse like that who has to quicken in the final eighth of a mile. And Say the Word, I mean, Joe Bravo, he was trying to get lucky coming through on the inside, but it just turned into a complete disaster. I mean, he got shuffled back to last at the top of the stretch, was trying to find room on the rail, but nobody came off the rail, and he was just never able to ride this horse, never even able to throw a cross at him. So Say the Word, I think, could have won this race if he had gotten clear at any point, but he just never was able to. So not a race I'm going to put too much stock in from a results-oriented standpoint. I think that there will be some horses that you might want to bet back out of this race in the future. I mean, for me, the big disappointment was Arklow, who, did wind up from the back of the pack and had to go very wide to do it. But, I mean, he just didn't show up here, and he was coming off that race in the UN where he had clipped heels on the turn, and it just feels like Arklow, for me, he's never been that trustworthy, and I wonder if maybe he's starting to go the wrong way.
Yeah, it could be. The one excuse I'd maybe give Arklow is I'm just not sure a course like Del Mar is one that's going to suit his abilities the best. I mean, he just dropped way back, and it's a race where you're not going to come from the clouds and win. But he's shown tactical speed before, so it could be that he's tailing off. As for Say the Word, I do want to mention I saw, of course, Joe Bravo got quite a bit of grief on social media. But honestly, sometimes that's just what's going to happen in a turf race. I don't give him a whole lot of fault. He was able to get to the rail from the far outside, save ground, and really, that's the only way you're going to win from there. It's really hard to sit outside, be 3 or 4 wide the whole way around, and sometimes trying to do that just doesn't work out. So, I mean, was it a terrible trip when you watch the replay? Yeah, but I can't give riders too much grief in those situations.
No, saving ground is what you want to do on the turf, and as you said, sometimes you got lucky, sometimes you don't. Some riders seem to have a way of bowling their way out and always finding room, others don't do that, so but definitely a horse that I think you can look for to run much better next time. The other graded stakes that we want to mention from this past week at Del Mar was one that was contested on Sunday. That was the Grade 3 Green Flash, going 5 furlongs on the turf. And Lieutenant Dan, a California bred, seems like he's really returned as an improved horse as a 5-year-old, as he just dominated some horses who had previously been towards the top of this division in the past. But, I mean, he made them look pretty ordinary in this spot.
Yeah, this was quite an effort. Now, I don't have the official speed figure. My assistant hasn't turned that one in yet. I'll get it later today, and I'm sure I'll put it on Twitter when I do the weekend recap. But pretty good estimate. I mean, it was the only sprint on the day, so it's not a super easy figure to make, but I would guess it's going to be somewhere from about 119 to 123. Normally, I narrow it down a little bit more than that, but not so much here because it's a little bit tougher looking at the worksheet that we use to create these speed figures. So I'll see what he comes up with. He's the California guy, but in any case, it was a good effort. He won this race handily. It's over the course and distance that we're going to see it for the Breeders' Cup. So it was certainly as fast, right up there with all the other sprinters we've seen, and he looked pretty dangerous to me here.
Yeah, he is a big, impressive horse. I mean, you could really tell that the size advantage that he has over everybody else when you see the horses turning into the stretch. But, I mean, the one thing I did not like about this performance is the way that he was trying to get out on the turn. And if he didn't have a horse right to his outside at about the 5/16 pole, it almost feels like he might have bolted because he was really trying to get out on his rider, Giovanni Franco, who was able to straighten him out once they got into the lane. But the horse who's had some layoffs and breaks, I don't like to see that, especially this far into his career and him now being a 5-year-old. So I have some reservations about this horse's prospects for the future, but he did deliver a nice performance here.
He did, and the one thing he's shown, he won this one on the lead as well as his last one, but he's also won from somewhat off the pace, which can come in handy in these short 5 furlong races because usually there's a ton of speed entered in them.
Let's move on to Saratoga on Saturday, where the big race was the Grade 1 Alabama for the 3-year-old fillies, the female counterpart to the Travers, which will be run later this week. And Monmouth was able to get back to her winning ways here after her narrow loss in the Coaching Club American Oaks. She was able to avenge that defeat to Maracuja, turn the tables on that one, and beat all the rest here. Monmouth's never going to be the flashiest winner of a race, but she just has a workmanlike way of getting it done.
Yeah, it was another good effort from her. I don't think many people would argue that she wasn't the best horse the last time when she suffered her first defeat. And this was back to the typical Monmouth. She didn't draw inside. She was able to get her run going on the outside. And just a really good effort from her. So she ran another 116 TimeformUS speed figure, which I think is the third one in a row for her. I think that should quell some of this talk about her taking on the boys, because there is a pretty big gap between the speed figure she's running and what we've seen from some of the top colts. But take nothing away from her. She's pretty much got the Philly Eclipse sewn up at this point, I would think, barring just some crazy run at the end of the year. And just a really solid horse that shows up every single time.
No, I mean, I would think first you might want to talk about potentially taking on Latruska, who's been running much faster than her throughout her entire campaign. So, yeah, there are some pretty good fillies, older fillies and mares out there that Monmouth would have to worry about before you even talk about taking on 3-year-old males or older males. But yeah, regardless of all of that silliness, she ran well here. She got another good trip for her, even though she was wide around both turns in the 2 to 3 path. That's the kind of trip that they want her to get. And even though, she stumbled slightly at the start, I didn't think it cost her anything at all. She was able to get into a mid-pack position after that, and she was just able to grind this field down. The one horse behind her that I thought did run really well was Clairiere, who got up for second. I didn't think that it was the easiest thing to run through kickback at that point in the day at Saratoga, because they had gotten a rainstorm in the middle of the day, and they harrowed the track again for the Alabama, and it seemed like some horses that were in behind just were completely covered with dirt and not running through it. And Clairiere is one of the few that did, and she was finishing on really well at the end of this race. I know that I had some concerns about her getting the mile and a quarter distance, and I think she answered that question here. So for me, they were clearly the two best runners in here. And Maracuja, who had upset Monmouth up in Coaching Club, didn't get as favorable a trip here, and she just wasn't able to run back to that performance.
Yeah, and I would say it's good that you mentioned the rain in the card. This was not an easy speed figure to make, because it was the only 2-turn race, and the track did come back looking pretty fast. And being these are 3-year-old fillies, it's always possible that they improve, but without a whole lot to go on with other races on the card, other than a couple sprints, it's possible she did run faster than a 116, but there's only so much data you can work with in these situations. Unfortunately, sometimes that happens where the card gets split. There were some turf races on the card as well, so not the easiest figure to make for sure.
Yeah, at least Saratoga was nicer to you than Woodbine was on Sunday, but we'll get to that in a little bit. The other graded stakes that we should mention before moving on from Saratoga's Saturday card was the Grade 2 Lake Placid, one of the few races they ran on the turf on Saturday, as they had gotten a ton of rain in the New York area, or I should say the Albany area. And the technical analysis, the winner of the Lake Placid, they just rode her like she was the best horse, sent her to the front end, and she handled the going in a race where some others probably didn't.
Yeah, she's certainly proven to be pretty versatile. She was able to win on a slower yielding course. She won on the firm last time. Last time she was able to track the pace. This time she was able to go wire to wire. She got a 115 TimeformUS speed figure, so she certainly compares well with Going Global. Those two seem to have about the same amount of ability at this point. So really good 3-year-old filly who I like the versatility as much as the 115.
Yeah, I know this is one of those European purchases from overseas. As a yearling that Chad Brown has been really high on throughout. She's kind of a quirky horse. She tends to want to run off a little bit in her races, and I know that was something that Jose Ortiz had to figure out about her in the Wonder again when she disappointed, finishing 6th in that race. He kind of let her go a little bit into a stalking position, and she was without cover for the entire race, and she's the kind of horse that I think either needs to be on the lead or covered up in behind, so she's she's going to relax. And in this race, they just sent her to the front end. And she did get to a bit of her antics on the far turn as she drifted out into about the four-path, but I don't think it mattered that much. She was just so much superior to the rest of the field here. And the others, they're just a cut below. I mean, I think Ego Trip, who was third, is going to be a heavy favorite in a maiden race at some point because they got pretty ambitious running a maiden in this Grade 2 event. But technical analysis just better than these horses.
Yeah, I almost wondered when I was watching the race if that drift wasn't almost intentional, because the rail didn't seem to be the best place to be in the limited turf races that we saw. But maybe not. Maybe it was just her goofing off.
One other race to mention from Saratoga before we get back there to talk about some juveniles later in this podcast. One other stakes race to talk about was the Summer Colony run on Sunday. This is just a restricted race for fillies and mares that had not won a sweepstakes yet this year. And Horologist, who does have a nice resume from past years, she fell into that category, so able to get into this race. And she just absolutely dominated on the front end. Craig, I'll let you talk a little bit about the difficulty of making a speed figure for a race and a day like this when rain is kind of falling throughout the second half of the card, but clearly she was superior to the rest of this field.
Yeah, it's another one of those Saratoga days where you really got to monitor the weather to see what's happening, but she still, I mean, it wasn't the toughest speed figure to make. The gaps in the field didn't help much either, but she got a big 127 TimeformUS speed figure, and she was coming out of another really big effort in the Shoe V, where I think she was definitely the best horse that day when she was run down late by Royal Flag, but she got a much better figure from us. And on Sunday, there was just no messing around. She went right to the front. She set really fast fractions. They were in the 140s. She obviously got tired late, but everyone else got more tired trying to catch her. All the fractions in red here, but just what a massive effort, I thought. And this is a horse after a couple of really subpar races, one at Pimlico and one just putrid effort, to be honest, at Thistledown. She did have a bit of a trip that day, but she just didn't really do much running at all. And she's come back with two huge efforts. Usually a 5-year-old mare like this who kind of goes off form, I usually don't have high prospects for him, but just a really nice training job by Bill Mott. And with these kind of races she's run last two, I think she's thrust herself right back into the distaff conversation.
Yeah, for me, it's always cool that Horologist is a New Jersey bred because we don't see too many of those running anymore, and she's actually competing at the top of the game, so that's just really neat. She actually did get her start at Monmouth Park for different connections, but now she's competing for Bill Mott, I think, as a 5-year-old, and still doing it really well. Now, this race did get a little bit easier because Dunbar Road, who was going to be one of the favorites, scratched out. She'll be running, I believe, in the Personal Ensign a little bit later this week, so we'll see how she does there. So not the toughest competition for Horologist, but she was a dominant winner of this race, and it seemed like a fast one, so we'll see if she can do it against graded stakes competition in the future. Let's move on to Woodbine, where they ran a few stakes races on Saturday, including their first leg of the Canadian Triple Crown, the Queen's Plate. And we had kind of a mixed bag of local horses in this race. I know that they've had an abbreviated season at Woodbine, so maybe some horses not able to kind of compile the resumes that they usually would coming into the Queen's Plate. So it seemed like a race that was ripe for a shipper to pick up, and that was the case with Safe Conduct, who came in from New York, coming off a performance where he was just a little overmatched in the Belmont Derby, and the class really worked for him here.
Yeah, it did. Should mention it was on Sunday. That's when they run the Queen's Plate. But yeah, this was a big field. Safe Conduct came in, was able to get the money. The one thing I took from this race was Irad Ortiz won this race because turning for home, I thought this horse was beat, and he just made every right move that you possibly could. He kind of moved off the rail a little bit, was able to keep a few of his competitors a little wider, and just rode really strong home. So in a race that was really close on the wire, I thought he was a big difference in here, and the difference between winning and losing, which you say is true about the class. These are Canadian breds. He only got a 102 TimeformUS speed figure, which is actually the same figure he ran when running 8th in the Belmont Derby. So definitely a step down in class, but he proved he was able to handle that Tapeta surface at Woodbine. I have no idea what kind of plans they have for him if he would try the Prince of Wales. His dirt races look pretty not very strong in the past performances. So I would imagine they won't try to go for that Triple Crown.
Yeah, I would have thought that this might be a speed figure that's difficult to make because for a 13 race card, I found it surprising that Woodbine just ran 2 races on the Tapeta with 11 turf races, and the other one was a 1-turn race. So that seemed a little odd to me, but maybe it was pretty straightforward. As you said, it's not like the local horses have been running that fast coming into the race, so maybe it's not that surprising that a race like this only got a 102 TimeformUS speed figure. I will say, with regard to safe conduct, he had a race back in May at Belmont, an allowance victory that I think has proven to be a lot stronger than the speed figure initially suggested. It was a race that was kind of featured a slow pace, and he came home extremely fast, and that's a race that a bunch of stakes horses and horses that have since run significantly faster have come out of. So, I mean, I think that's a better race than it seemed. But he was just a little classier than this field. The runner-up Riptide Rock, I thought, did make a really eye-catching run from far back, and for a race that didn't appear to have that much pace going on, it did kind of fall apart at the end, and Riptide Rock did make that eye-catching run. Maybe we'll see him in some of the future legs of the Canadian Triple Crown.
Yeah, and he was actually stretching out from a 6-furlong race, so you don't see that very often in a 1.25 miles, but he certainly showed that the distance was no problem for him.
The one Grade 1, Canadian Grade 1 race that they ran on that Sunday card at Woodbine was the Highlander, going 6 furlongs, and I've got to say, I was a little surprised that the only horse they bet was Caravel, the mare taking on the boys for the first time in her career. I mean, she did have some nice speed figures coming in, but it seemed like a tall order for her, and they bet her down to, I think, 1-2, and the second choice was, I want to say, 8-1. It just seemed like really giving some of the local horses who had shown some strong form previously absolutely no respect, and one of those was Silent Poet, who was able to get back to his better races here, and his better races were just good enough to beat these.
Yeah, the betting in here was puzzling. I made a tweet about it before the race. I mean, Caravel, she's a nice runner for sure, but she was 1-9 with 10 minutes to post, and I just found that ridiculous. There were males in here who were just as fast as she was on our speed figures, and it proved to be the tough task. Not to mention the 6 furlongs. I mean, she had won at 6 furlongs, I believe, somewhere along the way recently, but I think 5 furlongs is probably her best distance. She went to the lead here going 6, which, I mean, I'm not going to say I follow Woodbine religiously, but I've seen a lot of these 6 furlong races on the turf, and especially in the stakes, it's really tough to go wire to wire. It just seems like you have a target on your back the whole way around, and Silent Poet was just kind of tracking her. He was able to hold off the old veteran Admiralty Pier through the lane, who has just run all over the place. I think he's run as far as 1.5 miles. He cuts back to 6. He runs 1 1/8 miles. You never know where he's going to show up, but he always seems to do at least some running. So Silent Poet got a 117 TimeformUS speed figure. Caravel actually ran a 115, which is about what she always runs. Just one of those races where I think bettors went way overboard on a horse who didn't really have any edge.
Yeah, and Caravel was making her first start for Graham Motion here. I mean, and nothing against Graham Motion. I mean, he does a fantastic job, but I mean, she was coming off her performances for, a local mid-Atlantic trainer, Elizabeth Merriman, who had really done just a fantastic job turning her into the horse that she is. And they were taking on quite the feat here, trying to beat males, and it just didn't quite work out. Like you said, I don't think Caravel lost anything in defeat. She ran pretty well relative to her other races. She just ran into some pretty good older male horses here. And I mean, Silent Poet had run a bunch of these races in the past. I know that he was coming off a couple of subpar efforts to kick off his 6-year-old season, but he got back to one of his good ones, and that was just good enough to beat these. The other graded stakes we're going to mention from that Sunday card was the Dance Smartly, a Canadian Grade 2 event. And again, this one was won by a horse that was shipping in from New York, and that was Muta Makina for Christophe Clement. Dylan Davis came in to ride this horse. And I've got to say, watching this race, I thought Dylan Davis maybe got a little bit too aggressive on the far turn, kind of underestimating how long that stretch can be at Woodbine. But she was able to use her stamina to hold sway late.
Yeah, I thought the same thing watching the race. Like you said, she kind of put that target on her back for that really long stretch that they have. For people who don't know, the main turf course is outside of the dirt course, so it's quite the run home there. Not like your normal turf course, but she was able to hang on. She did it with her typical 116 TimeformUS speed figure. So she was just a well spotted horse. This wasn't the strongest grade 2 that you're going to see. I mean, blame Debbie, she's fine, but she was, I believe, the second choice in here. And Etoile, who went off, I think, 6-5, are pretty heavily favored and just had never really run a very fast race. So she won the EP Taylor, I think it was last year, but with a really subpar figure. So good effort from Muda Makina, but not one I'm going to be overly excited about going forward.
No, I agree with that, and I think Dylan got a little bit lucky with that horse because Etoile, it turns out, just as you said, she just isn't very good, and she got a perfect trip from Irad Ortiz, and he gave her plenty of time to get by the leader. She just didn't want to go by, and that's why Muda Makina was able to hold on. I mean, she's a decent horse for Christophe Clement, but I think in the U.S. she's more of like a listed stakes grade 3 type at best, so I wouldn't be expecting her to make a big splash in this filly and mare turf division later in the year. One more race to talk about from Woodbine last week was actually an allowance race that took place on Thursday, and that featured the return of the 2019 Belmont Stakes winner Sir Winston, who had been off form when we last saw him in 2020 and got no respect from the Canadian bettors in this race coming back over the Tapeta surface, but he got back into top form here and asserted his superiority over some pretty good allowance horses.
It's pretty funny when you mention this. I actually heard watching the Fox show on Saturday, I think maybe Sunday. Lafitte Pincaille had mentioned that Sir Winston had a winning effort at Woodbine this week, and even though I made the figures, I had no idea because I don't have names, so unless it's a stakes race, I'm not going to know who it is most of the time. So I had to go look it up. I was like, oh, that's a pretty big effort. He actually ran a 118 TimeformUS speed figure for this win. Who knows where it came from, because he certainly hadn't run anything like that recently. Even since he won the Belmont Stakes, he had won an allowance race with a figure less than that and had just went way off form. So who knows? Maybe it was the surface, but I tend to think Marquez figured out what was wrong and got him back in good form, and maybe he'll return to dirt soon, and we'll see if he can get back, against better horses. A 118 on the Tapeta. Who knows how that'll transfer to dirt, but it was good to see him in the winner's circle again. And I only saw that on replay as I saw because, like I said, I had no idea that the Belmont winner from a couple years ago had run on a Thursday afternoon.
Yeah, you know that he was a horse that I was a big fan of a couple years ago, and it just didn't quite work out for him after that Belmont Stakes victory. But I mean, all of his better races in the past had come on the dirt, not on synth, which he had run over a few times in the past and done okay, but he had run much faster speed figures on the dirt. And, it's not like he got some great trip in this race because he was hung out 3 to 4 wide around both turns, never had cover, and they weren't going that quickly up front. He made a big move into the race on the far turn and just ran away from a horse, the runner-up Special Forces, who's pretty good and who had run some nice speed figures in stakes races last year. So a really solid return to the races for Sir Winston. We'll see if they decide to keep him in Canada and run in some of those graded stakes on Tapeta, or if they bring him back down to the U.S. and run in some major dirt races. But nice to see a horse like that get back in form because it seemed like his career might have been finished after last year.
Yeah, and it's good to see a Belmont winner still around. It's not like he's a gelding, but, they're still racing him and had some faith in him, obviously, to keep him in training all this time.
Speaking of some major race winners from the 2019 three-year-old division, we saw the 2019 Travers winner come back with a big victory at Monmouth Park on Saturday in the Grade 3 Island, as Code of Honor, who had kind of had a disappointing 4-year-old season last year when it looked like he was kind of on the precipice of becoming one of the top handicap horses, and he never quite got there, tailed off at the end of the year, but off the layoff for Shug McGahee, boy did he deliver an impressive effort.
Yeah, I remember he came back last year. I think he won the Westchester with a nice figure, and he just kept running the same speed figure and over and over again, and it was never quite good enough to win. Ran into Nick's Go at the beginning of this year and didn't run very well that day, and have been laid off ever since. But he came back with a solid effort on Saturday. He got a surprising to me 126 Timeform US speed figure, but there were plenty of routes on that day, had plenty to go on, and it just seemed like a good effort. He beat a couple horses that always seem to run pretty well in West Will Power and Fat Man. So while they're not horses who are ever going to be confused with grade one types or anything like that, they're solid, and he did it really easily. So he looked like he's back in form for Shug McGahee.
Yeah, I liked the way that he did it too, because they went pretty slowly for that opening quarter mile, and you could see on the backstretch Paco Lopez was kind of deciding when he was going to move, and he made a really early rush to push the pace with this horse at about the half-mile pole, and you could see in the pace figure line how he really quickened up about midway through the race, and he just kind of kept ratcheting up that pressure, and sometimes horses who aren't of the quality that Code of Honor is, when they make that move to push the pace on the far turn, they're not able to sustain it into the stretch, but he just kept getting faster as they came through the lane, and a really impressive performance from him, and I'll be interested to see if he's able to make that move up into Grade 1 company in the fall, because based on this kind of effort and knowing the landscape of the handicap division, I mean, it's kind of ripe for a horse like him to make a splash.
Yeah, for sure. I'm not sure what the plans are for him, and sorry, I just can't resist this. He didn't even feel the whip on Saturday. He was handridden all the way around.
Yeah, we had a few of those around the country, including many at Monmouth Park on Saturday. Let's finish up this podcast by talking about some 2-year-olds, and we're just going to group them all together. We're going to talk about racing from a few different circuits, and we'll begin with some notable performances by the juveniles at Saratoga. One that was a stakes winner that took place on Friday was the off-the-turf Skidmore, which was won by the filly Averly Jane, who was beating males here, and a race that I know a lot of people thought was visually impressive watching it, but not the fastest stakes performance we're going to see from the 2-year-old fillies.
No, and that tends to happen. I remember watching it thinking, wow, that's going to be a big number. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with a 96 for a 2-year-old filly in August. I mean, it was a good race, but it didn't really match the visual. And that tends to happen in these off-the-turf races. A lot of the horses that actually stick around were not intended to run on the dirt. Some of the ones who were main track onlys really hadn't been that good to start with. They didn't have faith. One of them was a maiden. The other one, Golden Bell, went off the second choice and only had a slow figure before going to Ascot and really doing no running on the turf. So Averly Jean kind of stood out. She backed it up. Solid 96, so no knocks on her, but we'd like to see her do it against some better fillies.
I think we saw some better horses that might have graded stakes in their future on Saturday's card at Saratoga when they ran 2 divisions of a 6.5 furlong maiden race for the 2-year-old males, and Todd Pletcher won both of them, but one of those winners caught a lot of people's attention. That was the 7th race, the 2nd division of the race, won by My Prankster, a horse who had been working extremely well in the mornings and ran to those works in the afternoon, and he just absolutely decimated this field, winning off by 10 lengths.
Yeah, that was a big number from him. He wound up with a 111 Timeform US speed figure, which off the top of my head, and I should have looked it up, I think it's the fastest we've seen from a 2-year-old, definitely from a 2-year-old maiden. And just everything about this race looked good to me. He didn't do it wire to wire. He's able to track horses a little bit. And when he went to the front, it was just over. And some of the horses behind him, though, they were well beaten. I mean, they ran pretty good figures. The 2, 3, 4 finishers all ran in the mid to upper 90s. So he just put him away. And who knows what kind he's going to be. I'm not sure what the breeding looks like on him, but I know that he certainly ran a really big race on Saturday.
Yeah, and I mean, as the morning line maker for Saratoga, I've kind of been surprised at how little the public has respected Todd Pletcher in these 2-year-old races at this Saratoga meet, because in the past, a horse that was coming off the kind of workouts that my prankster had. And I mean, I watched these workouts on XBTV to kind of get a sense of what these horses are doing in the mornings. And I mean, he had been working from the gate extremely impressively. I mean, in the past, a horse like this might have bet down to even money, but I mean, Todd Pletcher's had some weak years with the 2-year-olds in the past, especially at Saratoga, so I know that his stats kind of aren't up to what they once were, but I mean, he's come back roaring in 2021 because I think or I should say after this weekend, because he had another one on Sunday, he's now had 6 2-year-old winners, 2-year-old debut winners at Saratoga this year. So Todd Pletcher can still do it with these horses that are working well, and my prankster definitely was. And as for the pedigree, I mean, he's by into mischief, with no surprise, top sire of juveniles in the country. But the damn My Wandy's girl was a really nice runner. I think she began her career in Puerto Rico, but she came to the U.S. and I think competed for Mike Hushin, and she won the Barbara Fritchie. I think she ended her career with 15 out of 25 victories. So she was a really nice racehorse, and this is her first serious foal, so my pranks are definitely one that will probably be targeted at the Champagne at Belmont, and I'll be interested to see how he runs there.
Yeah, you make a really good point about Todd Pletcher. Sometimes, trainer stats are great, but like you said, if you looked at his stats the last couple years, they weren't very good, where the few years before that, they were absolutely fabulous. And sometimes those short-term trends, you really got to look. It's been pretty obvious this meet that he's sending his 2-year-olds out to fire. So I'm not sure why the public hasn't caught on yet. But just by the way he ran in those workouts, that you point out, 7-2 was a bit crazy in here.
And Todd Pletcher also had the winner of the other division of this race on Saturday, the first of the day. That was Major General, who was half of an entry, got the job done by Justin Neck. And obviously this one was kind of overshadowed a little bit by the winner of the other race, My Prankster. But I thought Major General, he ran pretty well in his own right. Not quite as professional as My Prankster was, because he was kind of hanging on his wrong lead for the entire stretch drive, but he still ran a respectable race.
Yeah, he did. He ran a 104 TimeformUS speed figure, which is really good for a 2-year-old. So no knocks on him. Him winning this race makes the price in the 7th even more crazy because people had just saw this race. It should have been fresh in their mind, but just good gritty effort from him. It'll be interesting to see if Todd can get him straightened out and get him changing leads, because that could certainly add some points to his speed figure total. But a 104 is not too shabby this time of year.
Yeah, I know there was a bit of a bump in deep stretch that the stewards took a look at, but to me it looked like the runner-up was never really going by. He's now hung in 2 straight races, and Major General just appeared to be kind of goofy, and then once he saw that horse to his outside, he kind of kicked on again. And yeah, if he can change leads and run a more professional race, maybe he'll be able to do better in the future, but he does seem like a little bit more of a work in progress. Their 2-year-old maiden race to discuss took place on that Pacific Classic card at Del Mar on Saturday. That was, I think it was the 4th race of the day, won by debut winner Forbidden Kingdom, who was a My Racehorse spendthrift runner who's trained by Richard Mandela, son of American Pharaoh, and he put in a pretty gritty effort to win.
He did. He got a 99 TimeformUS speed figure for the win. There was definitely some bumping late in this race. The stewards took a look at it. I thought he might be coming down, to be honest, but they left him up, took down the second place finisher and put him third. As I think I mentioned, he ran a 99, so solid enough effort from him. Not quite as good as the couple that we saw at Saratoga, but Richard Mandela, he'll fool us sometimes. He can get a first-timer to win. He doesn't always do it. It's not always his MO, but usually when his horses run big first time out, they have a pretty good future coming.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go on and on about stewards' decisions, but it does seem like the Del Mar stewards are a little bit lost these days. This one was pretty perplexing, as you said. It seemed like the winner did it more than the runner-up, who was the horse that they ultimately did disqualify in this race. And I don't know what that was about. There were a few decisions like that at Del Mar this year that are just kind of confusing. But this one's by American Pharaoh. The dam is actually a half-sister to Sarah Louise, who is best remembered for beating Rachel Alexandra when she was a 2-year-old, I think, in the Pocahontas. This horse has a good pedigree. We'll see how far he ultimately wants to go. But I think that these are 3 nice 2-year-olds that finished first, second, and third in these races, well ahead of the rest of the field.
Yeah, and I should mention, I mean, we talked a little bit about it. I do think Rhetoric was the best horse in here. I think if he had room, he was probably going to win this race easily. Now, there's not going to be any value in that. The whole country that watched this race saw the trip. I doubt he's probably going to be 2-5. He's trained by Bob Baffert, but I do think the foul cost him the win.
Yeah, oh, for sure. I think Rhetoric was arguably the best horse in this race. It's just Flavien Prat rode him into a pocket with no way to get out. And I mean, he tried to come out, and another rider kept him in. And you can't just make room for yourself. And I think it's sending the wrong message to kind of promote a rider that was trying to push his way out a little bit. So I didn't get it at all. I don't think that the stewards are supposed to retroactively look at a race and say what the order of finish should have been when there's any kind of incident. You're supposed to look at whether a move was intentionally made to foul a horse that cost him a position. I don't think that was the case here, but that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't like riders getting rewarded for getting themselves in the jackpot. But like I said, I don't want to talk about it too much. There's been a lot at Del Mar, so that's enough on that topic for me.
Let's talk about one more debut winner, which took place at a track we haven't mentioned yet. That's Pimlico on, I believe, Saturday's card. And this is a horse, the winner of this race, HP Moon, who some people might remember was supposed to make his debut at Saratoga like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and this was one of those that if you were following, I think Dave Grenning tweeted about it, our DRF colleague, that there was an issue with identifying this horse before he got to the starting gate, and that forced the stewards to scratch him, so he didn't get to run that day. But I can see why they wanted to debut this horse at an elite meet like Saratoga, because Lacey Gaudet and the Connections have a pretty good one on their hands.
Yeah, this was quite the run here. It's a shame he didn't get the run at Saratoga. Not sure what happened there. It doesn't sound like it was a very good situation, but the horse can certainly run. It's one thing to see the 105 TimeformUS speed figure, which is very good, but I posted the race on Twitter. You can find it, Pimlico and Laurel. They post all of their races on YouTube, so you can go watch every replay of every race. This was the second race on Saturday, and visually, it's just awesome. I mean, the horse doesn't even have a clean start. Kind of tracks another horse and just absolutely blows them away. I don't know if it's one of those cases where he could have run faster. It looked like he was being hand-ridden pretty decent, but just a really good effort from him and an exciting horse from, not the usual connections that we see with a horse like this.
Yeah, this is a horse who I'm trying to rack my brain. I think he might have been an RNA at one of those 2-year-old sales and had a really impressive workout. That might be wrong. I'm trying to remember because I wrote the closer look for that Saratoga race, and I remember there was something about this horse that made him really appealing. But also his workouts at Delaware coming into this race were just extremely fast. If you look up some of those days, I mean, he was outworking older horses who are pretty good by a couple seconds. So he really had compiled an impressive work tab coming into this race, and he ran to those workouts. We'll see how far he ultimately wants to go. He's a son of the late Malibu Moon, and the dam is actually a half-sister to Travers winner West Coast. So there is pedigree for this one to stretch out. We'll just see if he's able to do it, because he clearly has a lot of speed and talent. Well, that's all the racing to recap this week. I'm happy to get back into the swing of things with Craig, and we will be doing 2 podcasts this week. In addition to this TimeformUS Pacecast, we'll also be coming back with the TimeformUS Forecast a little bit later in the week, and on that, we'll be talking about the Saturday Travers card at Saratoga. It's always stacked with talent. It seems like some of those races are coming up really strong, Craig, so I'm definitely looking forward to seeing the Travers, but also all of the undercard races, because it seems like we're going to have some of the leaders in different divisions competing on that card.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it as well. I haven't looked at too far ahead to see what the races are. I know I want to see Jackie's Warrior, and I think Life is Good is supposedly coming back in that same race. So even if that was just a match race, I'd be more than happy to see that one. So always going to be a big card, and look forward to digging into it.
Yeah, we've got, I think, Latruska supposed to compete in the personal ensign. One of my favorite horses, Tribovad, is competing in the sword dancer. So a lot going on Saturday at Saratoga, and we'll see how that all shakes out. We'll be handicapping that, and I think that podcast might be out late in the day on Thursday. So look for that then. Remember that you can always listen to these podcasts on drf.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, Rovigator Podcast. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for tuning in this week, and make sure to catch the TimeformUS forecast on Friday.